You're listening to Past Imperfect, a history podcast brought to you by the Center for Wisdom in Leadership at SPJ-IMR. I'm Dinyar Patel. In 1906, an obscure individual from an obscure South Indian port town came up with an audacious plan. V.O. Chidambaram Pillai, fired with Swadeshi spirit, decided to take on the commercial might of the British Indian Steam Navigation Company, perhaps the world's biggest shipping company at the time. Today, I'm joined by A.R. Venkatachalapathy, who has spent the past 4 decades of his life researching Pillai and his company, the Swadeshi Steam Navigation Company. Swadeshi Steam was a political act, but it was also a remarkable business venture. It raised capital from people across India, Burma, and South Africa, and, before it was brutally crushed by the British Indian government, successfully challenged one of the world's great multinational corporations. Thank you, Chalapathy, for joining me today. So your book, Swadeshi Steam, documents a pretty incredible story about how one man, V.O. Chidambaram Pillai, or VOC as you refer to him, founded a steamship company in 1906 in Tuticorin in South India to take on the monopoly of British-owned shipping. And you talk about in your book how VOC challenged both the political and economic might of the British Empire by doing so. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about how precisely he did this.
Thank you, Dinyar, for having me here. It's a delight to be in conversation with a fellow scholar. So, Chidambaram Pillai, I've been fascinated by Chidambaram Pillai ever since I was a young boy. I was in school. So, the crowning achievement of this man was that in the deep south, in the port town of Tuticorin, he decides to take on the British India Steam Navigation Company, challenges it by starting a shipping company. It actually does very well for a year or two before it is completely crushed. So this much of the story is very well known across Tamil Nadu. And Chidambaram Pillai is a local hero. That much is known. But unfortunately, we know in the Indian context, very little work gets done on many of our stalwarts.
Of
And
course.
on this particular case, Tamil Nadu, the Dravidian model, might be an exemplary model, and on all human development indicators, Tamil Nadu is leading other parts of India. But I suppose in the area of writing history, we are somewhat laggards. So this is what I've tried to do by piecing together bits and pieces of information across a wide variety of archives. I've tried to write this story. Briefly put, it is like this. At the beginning of the 20th century, Tuticorin or Thoothukudi is probably the 5th or the 6th largest port in colonial India. So it has a fairly vibrant trade. The main trade is between South India and Colombo, but it is also part of the larger Indian Ocean trade because it is one important point there. So the traders in Tuticorin had been trading from that port for a very long time. And as I also mentioned, that particular part, because of the changing coastline, still there has been a port for something like more than 2000 years. It has been part of the Indo-Greek. It's basically the trade with the Mediterranean and the Arab trade. There is a long story, but what happens in the mid-19th century is that it gets integrated into the imperialist trade network. And the British India Steam Navigation Company, or BI as it is called, has a monopoly over this trade.
Just to clarify, so you mentioned in your book that the British India Steam Navigation Company was the largest steam shipping company in the world at that time, and British owned.
Yes, probably. It is along with the P&O, the Peninsular and Oriental Steam Navigation Company. It is either the largest or one of the largest companies. And by 1916, during the First World War, these two behemoths get amalgamated and they become the biggest, undoubtedly the biggest. BI focuses on coastal trade, it is into passenger trade, and it has a guaranteed mail contract with the government, and it also is involved in moving troops. It moved the troops during the Great Revolt of 1857, and it was the very important carrier of indentured labor from South India and also from North India. What in the literature is called the Girmitiyas, and what in South India it is called the Coolies. So it is a really powerful company, and it also strengthens its monopoly by a variety of means. One of the things that it does is kill the coastal trade of the Coromandel coast, which was dotted by a number of small ports. So basically, the story is that any trader would actually, if he had to transport some stuff, he would sit on the coast with an umbrella, and whenever he saw a ship going by, he would hold up the umbrella and the ship would get the stuff and go. But this is not how imperialist shipping companies work. So what they do is the BI, British India Company, joins hands with the South Indian Railway, which is another British-owned railway company. They build a network in South India and then kill all the small port towns, small ports on the Coromandel coast, and the traders are all forced to move their goods through the South Indian Railway, either ship it from Madras or ship it from Tuticorin. So by the end of the 19th century, BI's monopoly is complete.
And I think it's important to note that this is something that's going on all across India, right? In the sense that, you have a pretty vibrant coasting trade in places like Bengal or what is today coastal Maharashtra and Gujarat. But as the railways move in and as these big steam shipping companies, which are British dominated, get even bigger and mightier, indigenous competition gets completely wiped out.
Yes, absolutely. This is a global story, but these stories, from the south, have really not been studied.
Of course
So I
not.
think the details are as important as the larger story, but it have their own inflections. So it does that. And uh, the other aspect of it is that the British India Company has runs completely with European agents. Not to speak of the ships themselves. We know that the ships were manned by the captains, the mates, the engineers were all European. And uh, the bulk of the wage bill went to this very cream of the crew, who are all Europeans. And while the menial work was all done by Indians, by Indians I mean the Indians of the entire Indian subcontinent. So the other aspect of it was that uh, there was a clear racial dimension to this whole trade, apart from the crew that I mentioned, because the agents were all British, Scottish. No, it was clearly inflected by their racist attitude towards the Indian traders. The Indian traders were smarting under this insult for a long time. But by the beginning of the 20th century, the first few years, there is a churning. By about the 1880s, once again, your work on Nauroji comes to my mind. By the late 19th century, the idea of India's exploitation, economic exploitation, being at the root of colonialism, becomes a very powerful idea which gets great traction with the new intellectuals. And this spreads across India, and it has its reverberations in South India. People like Subramanya Iyer clearly writes this wonderful book called Some Economic Aspects of British Rule in India. So in South India, in
So a book that doesn't get enough attention in many ways. I mean, we know about Ranade, we know about Nauroji, we know about Dutt. Iyer is someone who really gets left out of the conversation.
absolutely. So Chidambaram Pillai, who's in Thoothukudi, is clearly familiar with what's happening all over India. Says very clearly that he's reading all the newspapers, and he was very well aware of G. Subramania Iyer, because G. Subramania Iyer is not only the founder editor of the Hindu, but at this time he is also the founder editor of the Swadeshi Mitran, which is a really, really excellent daily. very sharp analysis, biting, cutting language. So clearly, the idea of economic nationalism has seeped deep into the South. And in the context of the Swadeshi movement after the partition of Bengal, Chidambaram Pillai, I think he's fired by this idea. We don't know the full details, but it's very clear that he has been reading all this stuff and he's taking this up. So that is the origin of the shipping company.
So it's really quite a remarkable account in the sense that you talk about this one man VOC who takes on again kind of the, if you will, the Google, the Apple, the Facebook of that era, except of course in a very different domain in shipping. We'll get to that in just a second, but I want to foreground it by talking about the Swadeshi movement. VOC establishes this company in around 1906, and from 1905 onward, all across India, but of course very much centered in Bengal, you have the Swadeshi movement taking place. And this is regarded by many Indian historians as quite a turning point in Indian nationalism, in the sense that finally you have popular activism for a nationalist agenda, and it's linked with campaigns like boycotting British goods, setting up Indian companies, talking about the promotion of Indian talents and Indian management, and a lot of development, a lot of the ideas that you were talking about earlier with regards to economic nationalism. It was written by authors like people like Iyer and Dutt and Naroji and Ranade. But when we talk about the Swadeshi movement, we mostly talk about Bengal. And your book really shows that other parts of India are playing a very important part in this movement as well. South India, as you had noted earlier, oftentimes gets a very short shrift when we talk about modern Indian history. And especially, I think, when we talk about Indian nationalism and things like the Swadeshi movement. So the question I want to ask you is, how does the story of VOC and the Swadeshi Steam Navigation Company revise our understandings of both the Swadeshi movement and South India's larger role in Indian nationalism?
Tamil Nadu, South India, we have always had this, grouse that we are given short shrift. That is largely true.
Absolutely.
That is absolutely true. But there is also a failing on our part. As I said, the South Indian or Tamil intellectuals, when we modernized, we put a premium on what is now called STEM, right? Science, technology, engineering, medicine, and we did not give adequate attention to the social sciences. So that said, when I started working on this, yes, I did swim against the tide. I decided not to take up STEM and wanted to pursue history. So this particular story, I would say, revises our existing understanding to a great extent. Because more work needs to be done. There are some one or two interesting monographs. We have, for instance, this book by Rajendran on the nationalist movement in Tamil Nadu, which just covers the first 2 decades. But more work needs to be done. That said, this story shows that Bengal, even though it was the epicenter, and also the bigger ramifications of the Swadeshi movement were in Bengal. We also know that Maharashtra under Tilak was one another important seedbed. Punjab was active. In South India itself, there were 2 or 3 centers. One is the coastal Andhra. The area around Rajahmundry was quite active. Chennai was a very important locus. Tuticorin becomes becomes like an like a meteor. Meteor would be the right term. For about 3 to 4 years, it attracts all India attention because there's a very vibrant movement, and this is also a very spectacular movement, as I mentioned. Swadeshi movement, though the dreams were big, the aspirations were big. In terms of material manifestation, it was more modest. Even in Bengal, though we had chemical companies and other things, the given the context that there was so little capital, so little managerial ability, it is actually very very surprising even astonishing to think that somebody would want to launch a shipping company. In that sense, I think it completely revises our understanding of the scope, the breadth, and the depth of the Swadeshi movement. And it is kind of ironic that this happens not in the core area but in the peripheral area. So now we really know that because of the close work that is done, the capital was mobilized from across South India and even farther apart. Even in Bengal, they were able to raise shares. So I don't see, for instance, the question of selling shares as purely a monetary transaction, a business transaction. Every rupee that was parted by the public for the shipping company actually meant an understanding of the idea of nationalism and the understanding of the economic exploitation that underpinned colonialism. So we really, really need to talk more about the all India nature of Indian nationalism, which I think is the real strength of the movement.
Absolutely. And, I think your book really helps us bring not just the Madras presidency, but, as you mentioned, relatively, I guess what you'd call today second tier towns and cities, places like Tuticorin to the forefront. I mean, the Madras presidency had a reputation in the colonial era of being called the benighted presidency, as you mentioned in your book. And I think as more work is being done, that reputation is being questioned. And it also shows how Swadeshi is very different in different parts of the country, right? And I mean, Bengal and in the Bengal and in the Bombay presidency, it's located in big urban conglomerations like Calcutta, Bombay, and Ahmedabad. And Madras, it could be in a place like Tuticorin. But as importantly, as you show, in the Madras presidency, it did not take on that kind of communalist flavor. It did not alienate Muslims. In fact, you show how VOC worked with Christians, he worked with Muslims, he worked with people from non-upper caste backgrounds, and there was a great degree of public support from these different groups as well.
Yeah. Before I get to your question, I also want to add something. When I say South India in terms of the reach of Swadeshi movement, something that I don't really discuss in my book, this particular book, but I hope to write about it more. Travancore state was also part of this. So we don't often associate Travancore with the Indian nationalist movement until the Vaikam Satyagraha happens in 1924-25.
Of course, yeah.
So I make reference to the assassination of Robert Ashe, who was seen as a villain in the crushing of the Swadeshi company. So of the 14 people who were indicted in that conspiracy case, 8 of them came from Travancore. So we also need to think a little more about the perceived silence of the Travancore, of the native states. So we actually need to do more work. So now actually coming to the very, very pertinent question of the social composition of the Swadeshi company. Now you are bang on target. So I think it's a very, very interesting and important point, especially given the context in which we live, where the idea of the nation seems to be very, very closely linked to the religion in which you are born. Apparently, all non-Hindus, their loyalty and patriotism is always suspect. Well, we do understand what happens in Bengal. So much work has been done about it. We have Sumit Sarkar's great work. The situation of Bengal is very different, given that in East Bengal, the vast majority of the peasants were almost exclusively Muslim, and the landlords, and to make it worse, most of them turned out to be absentee landlords, were all Hindus. And also the way the movement shaped, the challenge of how to mobilize people, you know, without recourse to pre-modern forms of communitarian mobilization was a big challenge. So each people have to handle it in their own way. We can analyze, but we cannot judge 100 years later. But in the Tamil context, I would say that the kind of deep divides that existed in Bengal did not exist for a variety of reasons. Because the arrival of Islam and Christianity in South India was through the course. It didn't come through the passes. The it came through the modality of trade, and we always know that trade is a very interesting way of cultural assimilation because it comes slowly. It comes with novel artifacts and ideas, and the zone of contact is not one of antagonism but of give and take. So Islam comes through that conduit, and it is spread over a very long period. Basically, the South India's engagement with Islam dates to the time of the Prophet. So that's how long it is. And coming to the question of Christianity itself, once again, there are two aspects to it. And Tuticorin, the place where this entire movement takes place, is the site of the first mass conversion of a community to Christianity, Catholic Christianity, in the context of, very interestingly, the the kind of violent nature of the Indian Ocean.
Is this the Paravar community?
Yes, the Parava community. So, in the mid 16th century, overnight, the entire community is baptized into Christianity by the Portuguese through Francis Xavier, because as a protection from the piratical and marauding nature of the Moor or the Arab traders. But this was a very different kind of a conversion. So that is one part. The other part is that Christianity's deep inroads into South India actually takes place in the deep south of Tamil Nadu, in this exact region where the Swadeshi movement is powerful. And a very important aspect of that is, if the Catholics in the 16th and 17th century believed in the trickle down theory of converting the upper caste and hoping that and expecting it to trickle down to the masses. Doesn't seem to work both culturally and also economically. Even now, they say that if the top layer of Indian society becomes rich, it will trickle down to the people below. Obviously, neither money nor culture or religion happens that way.
That's a different battle to wage.
Yes. So the Protestant missionaries in the 19th century focused on the lower caste, and they made a very big impact on the lower caste. So within 2 generations, there was a great leap in their social mobility. They got educated, they had better health services, they made a use of the access to education. And so all this creates a climate where, despite the friction, there is also much give and take. And I would also credit the leadership. There is a very, very conscious attempt on the part of VOC, Chidambaram Pillai, and others. Even though there was recourse to some religious idiom, there was a conscious decision to be accommodative. So, as I mentioned, in terms of religious communities, Hindus, Christians, Muslims are very much part of the company. There are at least three, if not four, directors in the company. Because director, there was a share qualification for becoming a director. So at least 100 shares had to be taken, which would mean 2,500 rupees. So whatever the limitations of the social composition of the company came from the economic constraint or not the social constraint. So if there were not adequate lower caste, there were lower castes. I mentioned that we have Nadars are there are Like many other backward castes, you know, the Maravars are there, the upper caste, Vellalars, Chettiars, Brahmins are all there. If some, if there are no Dalit communities, it is because of the economic constraint, not because of the social vision of its founders. So the very nature also of the crowds. Now we have fairly ample discussion of the crowds by the police. From the police reports clearly indicate that the crowds that came to listen to the Swadeshi lectures were from all communities and all castes. So we can get that from the description as, the crowd is rowdy, the crowd is full of badmashas, the crowd is full of scoundrels. I see it as proof of the fact that the crowds came from the lower orders of society, both in terms of caste and class.
So already, I think we can establish that things are very, very different from, say, what's going on in Bengal or even in Maharashtra and Gujarat, where merchant communities or in Maharashtra, a lot of Brahmins were involved in Swadeshi activism. So let's turn to the story of VOC. So you describe in the book how VOC as a second grade pleader, someone who did not have too much education, um, jumps into the limelight, right? Someone who had been involved in some nationalist activity beforehand, had, I think, attended one of the Madras Congress sessions, for example, but relatively obscure. And he just completely jumps out from nowhere into the national spotlight by helping found this organization, the Swadeshi Steam Navigation Company, and also then becoming the preeminent leader of this organization, even though he only holds the official role of, I think, assistant secretaryship, as you mentioned. And it was designed, as you mentioned, to challenge this group, the British India Steam Navigation Company, one of the world's, if not the world's largest shipping behemoth. What exactly was VOC's plan to bring Swadeshi activism to the south of India and also more directly to challenge BI? What can you take us through the precise steps that VOC had in mind?
Okay. So, as you have mentioned, Chidambaram Pillai came from a fairly modest background. Yes, he belongs to a landholding company, landholding family and community, fairly well off. But in terms of educational accomplishments, formal educational accomplishment, he's not a graduate, he's a matriculate, and then he has acquired a leadership certificate. Because of his background, his social background, he has uh, cultural and intellectual capital. So his community is known for its cultural accomplishments. So they have close links with the Saiva monasteries. So they have access to traditional forms of knowledge. But that said, it is nowhere in comparison with the kind of access that other nationalists had. He didn't go to the big colleges in Madras city or Kumbakonam or Tiruchi or even Madurai. Okay, so that is one aspect. So, but unfortunately, we know very little about what sparked his interest in the nationalist movement. He mentions two or things, very tantalizing bits of information. One is that he very clearly states that in 1893, I was first under the impression that it could be a misprint, but very clearly he says in 1893, when I was 21 years of age, I came across the writings of Tilak. So he says he's aware of it. Then we don't know anything until 1898 when he is participating in a local Congress meeting in his own village to select or elect delegates to the 1898 Madras Congress. But he doesn't actually go to the Congress. We don't know why. And then the next bit of information we have of what inspired him was he says he met Swami Ramakrishnananda, who is one of the first disciples of Sri Ramakrishna Paramhamsa. So basically, in terms of seniority, probably is even more senior than Swami Vivekananda. But he is a very important monk who lives in Chennai for about nearly 15 years. So Chidambaram Pillai says that he met him once, and then the conversation that we had with him, he said, planted the sweet seed of Swadeshism in his heart. That is what he says. Beyond that, we don't know anything. But he also mentions that he was reading newspapers. He makes a very clear expression that I kept pace with what was happening in the world through the newspaper. So he knew what was happening in South India. He knew the larger nationalist project, knew what was happening in Maharashtra and Bengal, and also from the prospectus, the first prospectus that he releases, is very clearly aware of the larger global context. So we actually find some parallels with Tagore. You know, Tagore talks about the revival of India not in isolation, but the revival of India in the context of the revival of the East. So this is an idea that really, really finds expression in Chidambaram.
Pan-Asianism.
Pan-Asianism. So you find that in the prospectus, he says that we will try our best not to hire any European marine professional. We'll actually try to go for Asiatics. Basically, it means Japanese. He also promises that he will get Indian sailors trained in Japan. He constantly talks about Asiatic revival. Then the other aspect that you find is also, there is a sense of history. He is very keenly aware, even if vaguely, that India was a glorious civilization. And by glorious civilization, he did not just mean cultural achievements, but he also meant economic achievements, maritime exploits, and other exploits. But here, once again, it's a very curious thing. Now, in 2024, entire India is aware of the naval exploits of the Cholas, right? After the Punniyin Selvan film has come. But when Chidambaram Pillai wrote this prospectus for the shipping company, he actually makes no mention of the Cholas. Why? Because it was not known. So it comes to light only in the 1920s. But that said, he was very much aware of, or at least bought into the discourse of the great ancient industries of India. So very clearly, uh, buying into the arguments and the evidence presented by Nauroji, R.C. Dutt, and others, that it is with the arrival of the British that we have been deindustrialized. That is a point that he constantly makes. So this is the larger climate that he was working in, and he was very much aware of all these ideas. So that is how he sets out to do it. How he breaks away from the pack is that he thinks of this spectacular idea of starting a shipping company. And here also it is very interesting that he doesn't jump to that idea right away. First, he is going only for the chartering of ships. Right, I mentioned it, the Bora Muslim company of S.R.G. Tajboy, called Shoreline Company from Bombay. They charter a ship. It turns out to be a very fractious and difficult relationship. So anybody else would have given up the idea. But what really captures our imagination is that this man, rather than being disheartened by a fairly audacious step, chartering ship is itself quite a challenging task. We also have to remember that Chidambaram Pillai didn't go to IIM. He didn't go to the IIMs. He was not aware of management principles and had no experience in business management. So instead of being disheartened, he actually decides to make a further leap of starting a shipping company. So the shipping company, the idea itself is big. He thinks of an authorized capital of 10 lakhs of rupees. It's a huge, huge sum, right?
Massive
Uh,
amount in that day.
Massive amount,
Absolutely massive.
absolutely massive amount. Very clearly, he understands the concept of a joint stock company. I mean, in the 21st century, when we register limited companies left, right, and center, this must have been something completely new. And certainly in a small town like Tuticorin, actually, from the evidence that I have noted, barely, barely a handful of companies had been registered. Public limited companies had been joint stock companies, as they were called, south of Madras. And whatever were registered were all British companies. Harvey's were a joint stock company, but that is a British company. So he makes that leap, and that is what marks him out from others. And that is why, despite the disadvantage of location, he bursts into the national scene. He also builds a network. He establishes branches in Colombo, in Madras, in Calcutta, and in Bombay.
And he gets shareholders and people who are donating money from a huge geographical diversity, right?
Yes, yes.
Natal, Southeast Asia, of course, all across India as well.
Yeah, and then Sri Lanka as well. So this is the idea, and that is what is. Um, it is a mystery. How this man, with these limited and modest uh, background, first can conceive of this idea, then secondly that he can actually execute it, and thirdly, to anticipate your question, thirdly the question is, where does he get the courage? Very clearly, he's not jumping into it without thinking. He is not going to be given subsidies by the British government for starting this company. He knows what he's in for.
In many ways, it's quite an audacious venture. I think that might be the best word to capture it, in the sense that, you know, establishing a company under colonial conditions is difficult enough, but doing so on such a scale and against such a incredibly powerful rival, which, as you mentioned in your book, was basically a parastatal organization, an organization that had close, intimate links with the colonial government. That took, to put it mildly, a great degree of courage.
So this is the other aspect of it. So uh, it is evident that he knew what he was in for. And as the obstacles increased, the first year or the first 6 months, trouble comes only from the BI company. That is the local agents. They think, this would be one other flash in the pan.
Something they can easily crush.
Yes, yes. Initial rush of blood, of which, I'm sorry to say, we Indians, our compatriots, are very good at. Uh, so many of our big projects have fizzled out. Uh, so that is what they think. But as it slowly gains traction, so you find that they start giving pinpricks. Then it snowballs into things bigger. They start using the local district administration, the police, and the district officers and the port officers to give trouble. Then, by the time the company, the Swadeshi company, decides to buy ships, and he's actually trying to, he's running the gauntlet. Chidambaram Pillai is, moving farther and farther up, and what he does is, uh, politics is very much part of this enterprise. All through this promotion of the company, he's organizing public meetings, traveling far and wide, giving Swadeshi speeches, selling the idea of Swadeshi enterprise. The when his fellow promoters, the other traders, most of them decide that you shouldn't take politics too far because it is going to cause trouble for the company. He rather than backtracking. So this is what makes Chidambaram Pillai the big hero that he becomes. Instead of backtracking, he actually ups the ante. So we actually find the district collector and others, also his colleagues, saying that after he goes to Surat,
The Surat Congress of 1907. Yeah.
he actually comes back even more fired up.
And this, of course, is the Congress session where the radicals and the moderates split.
So the other change is that until that point, even that point, he is still seen only as a very local leader. But within that 1 week of his traveling to Bombay and then going to Surat and coming back, for instance, Subramanya Bharati is now saying, our leader, he says, Namade Talaivar. So he is becoming a leader. Obviously, the respect that he is able to command with the leadership, Tilak, Aravinda Ghosh, Lajpat Rai, Motilal Ghosh, and others is very. So that is until that point is seen only as a very local leader. This is when he begins to rub shoulders, but that also uh, is striking because he steps into this great and challenging project before his closeness to the All India leadership. His interaction and closeness with the All India leadership happens after he's actually started this big project. That is also something. And then the local support these days is able to build. So I've made an analysis of all those who were arrested following Chidambaram Pillai's imprisonment. They come from all communities, all castes, all classes. So it becomes a direct fight, and then we see this that the government, the governor of Madras presidency, this huge sprawling presidency, Arthur Lawley, almost takes Chidambaram Pillai's challenge personally. So you can see that he is personally involved in ensuring that Chidambaram Pillai is put behind bars. So in that long 32-page fine print document where he meets a deputation from Tirunelveli, it is full of references to Chidambaram Pillai where he is basically saying, why have you let him loose for so long? Why did you give him such a long rope? Why did you permit him to take this anti-government stride and nationalist stance? So that is uh, the undercurrent of this opposition. So the British, both the company, the PI company and the government, to them it is clear that it is not a flash in the pan, it is not just a storm in the teacup, it is having the potential to boil over and become a challenge to the British economic and political might.
So by early 1908, VOC is in many ways doing a two-part act, right? In the sense that he has become, as you write in your book, the acknowledged leader of the Swadeshi movement in the Madras presidency. He is someone who is recognized as the preeminent leader of the radicals in much of South India. He had a chance to meet with many other associates of Tilak at the Surat Congress. He comes back very radicalized, as you said. And at the same time, his company, Swadeshi Steam, is inflicting an incredible commercial blow on the commercial interests of British India Steam. You note that in early 1908, not a single Indian merchant shipped his cargo through the British company. They all went through the Swadeshi company instead. And then a third thing happens, right? You talk about how VOC played a role in organizing a strike at Coral Mills, another large industrial venture owned by European interests, managed by a Scottish firm. And this leaves Europeans so terrified, as you write very eloquently in your book, that they decide to decamp town and just live on boats in the harbor, which must have been such a moment of transformative change in the attitudes of Europeans who had been once upon a time been used to commercial and political dominance, unquestioned dominance in the city. And then a reaction kicks off. Can you take us through what that reaction is like? I mean, you talk about something called the Tirunelveli riots, and then, of course, you alluded to previously, VOC's arrest and imprisonment. Can you take us to what happens after, this show of strength on the part of VOC and Swadeshi Steam, and how it descends into both violence and repression, and particularly repression against VOC?
So I think we should start immediately after his return from Surat. So by the first week of January 1908, he's back from Surat. He's all fired up. So that's when what they do is, on the beach front of Tuticorin, every day they organize Swadeshi meetings. At that point, he is joined by another nationalist, a mendicant, at that point completely unknown, called Subramanya Siva. So on the streets, on the beach front of Tuticorin, they begin to give public speeches. And even by police reports, as we are all familiar, police reports always tend to underestimate the crowds, the number of people who participate. But even the police reports say that something like 3,000, 4,000 people joined the meetings. And for the first time, extended public meetings, as distinct from hall meetings, where turbaned people spoke in English. Here, in the public, with the crowd from cutting across classes, they are addressed in the Tamil language. So this is what the fantastic Chicago anthropologist, historian Bernard Bate, he calls this particular moment oratorical incandescence, very evocative term. So this captures the mind of the people, and it is manifest immediately in terms of how it empowers the common people, and they challenge the Europeans on the street. So you have the testimony of some of the Europeans. One trader is saying that when I used to go on my cycle, if people used to give me way and not hinder my path. Now when I cycle, the little boys are shouting Vande Mataram, jeering at me. And then Jatka drivers, that is the horse cart riders, purposely they keep cutting in my path and stopping me from going ahead. So on an everyday basis, the quotidian nature of the challenge is very interesting. I give an instance of the BI company's manager's car driver who refuses to take his insults anymore. So this is what empowers them, and every day the mobilization increases, and that is at that point Chidambaram Pillai opens another front. There is a big British-owned shipping company, British-owned spinning mill in Tuticorin with about 2,000 workers. He leads a strike there
Coral
against the
Mills.
coral mills. The strike is for very, very genuine grievances, and Chidambaram Pillai not only organizes relief for them, he also talks to them every day, politicizes them, and then on their behalf, he negotiates with the joint magistrate of Tuticorin. So he's now upping the ante. So one more economic target is being attacked. And then he also promises that he will soon start a cotton mill. So he's talking really, really what from the British point of view is very dangerous stuff. So as this mobilization increases, the district administration, under instructions from Madras, governor and council decides, it's high time this man is silenced. It is also at this time that March 9th, Bipin Chandrapal, who had been arrested in the Bande Mataram case for refusing to testify against Aurobindo Ghosh, is supposed to be released on March 9th. So Chidambaram Pillai decides that this day will be celebrated as Swarajya Day. So he plans massive meetings. So the British, the police, the administration decide that that meeting should not be held. So they institute security proceedings, and then he is summoned to the district headquarters called at Tirunelveli. So here a very interesting exchange takes place between Chidambaram Pillai and the district magistrate. Very, very sharp exchange which has been immortalized in the poems of Subramanya Bharati. So as the proceedings go on, we find a very interesting instance of this man's uh, audacity or even foolhardiness, if one doesn't know. So he suddenly tells the collector that he wants an adjournment. He says, the collector asks, why do you want an adjournment? He says, I want to go out and address a public meeting to welcome Bipin Chandrapal. The collector is furious. He said, the purpose of this very proceedings is to stop you from doing that. But he goes out, speaks at the meeting, and then actually he does something more provocative. The next day, early morning, he catches an early train, goes to Tuticorin, organizes another procession which had been postponed from the earlier day, and then comes back to Tirunelveli and once again presents himself to the collector. Really, really infuriating, insolent uh, 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 activity by Chidambaram Pillai from the point of view of the British. So
Direct provocation in many ways.
direct provocation. So that is at that point. Once again, the collector makes this man an offer. He tells him that by the time he has received sanction for proceeding against sedition against Chidambaram Pillai, so he tells Chidambaram Pillai that if you promise to leave this area, go off to Bombay or some place for 6 months or 1 year, all proceedings against you will be dropped. So at this point, Chidambaram Pillai poses a counter question. He says, can you promise me that you will not harm the Swadeshi company? Well, the collector, the very idea of sending him away is to crush the company. Obviously, they're not going to let him go. So he's arrested. Immediately after his arrest, this happens on the 12th of March in the afternoon. Next day, there is a huge protest violence, both in Tuticorin and in Tirunelveli, which goes by the name of riots. So there is the irate crowd, the protesting crowd, attack all government buildings. They set fire to a kerosene depot which keeps burning for 3 days. And then the violence is quelled by shooting. 4 people die, and very interesting instances happen. The crowd goes into the government offices and pulls down the portraits of King Edward VII. They also turn to the police and say, if you are Swadeshis, you should actually join us. So this kind of activity goes on, but it is quelled. And they are all charged with arson, rioting, incendiarism, and more than 100 people are convicted. And the social composition of this crowd is so wide. It's a very, very democratic uprising. Meanwhile, the sedition case against Chidambaram Pillai is going on, and the proceedings are wound up in 3.5 months, and he is given what is a completely draconian sentence. he gets two life imprisonments, one for delivering seditious speeches, and another even more atrocious. He is given another 20 years for abetting the seditious speeches of Subramanya Siva. What is ironic is that Subramanya Siva himself gets only 10 years for giving the seditious speeches.
Mm-hmm.
The
So
judge
clear
says very
targeting of
clearly,
VOC.
says that even though that man spoke, this is the man who is responsible. But this is truly draconian that it even annoys John Morley. So our great liberal Secretary of State, he says, this is not on. You can't give two life imprisonments to a person who has only one life. So
And just to put it in context also, I mean, Tilak, when he was tried, I mean, the worst that happened to him was that he was exiled for a few years to Burma. People like Bipin Chandra Pal or Aurobindo, likewise, I mean, they were either externed for a little bit or went into self-imposed exile. And these are much bigger fish in many ways than VOC, and VOC is getting not one but two life terms.
yes, see, Tilak himself gets only 6 years. As you say. So this is truly draconian. Then he starts the legal battle. So that is one side. As he is doing the legal battle, the shipping company is rudderless. But luckily, two or three very idealistic people, they take up they take up the responsibility. But unfortunately, their idealism is not matched by their charisma. Chidambaram Pillai, obviously, obviously also had great charisma. So even though these people toiled a lot, but in the wake of Chidambaram Pillai's draconian sentence, which really scared the shit out of people. I mean, this is terrified people. I mean, people are justly not only horrified but fearful of what would happen. So this is a big blow to the company. So meanwhile, Chidambaram Pillai is in prison, and in the prison, he is made to do the worst kinds of labor. All the harsh punishments prescribed by the jail manual is inflicted on him, including the pulling of the oil mill, the chucky, which is only the bulls do it, right? But luckily, when he goes to the High Court, even though the court confirms the conviction, he says he's guilty of sedition, no doubt about it, but it reduces the uh, sentence to 6 years. So in prison, Chidambaram Pillai is completely cut off from the outside world. And as you know, this reign of repression is an all India phenomenon. Tilak is arrested, the movement in Bengal is crushed, Arabindo
Press
Ghosh,
Act of
yes,
1910 is passed.
yes, Arabindo Ghosh is takes is exiled to Pondicherry. So the movement is basically crushed by about 1910. The movement is crushed, and because the movement is crushed, uh, idealistic youth take to the path of what is called revolutionary terrorism. In Bengal, it is numerous cases happen. In Tamil Nadu itself, the case of Ash, who was assassinated for crushing the company. So when Chidambaram Pillai comes,
Robert Ashe, just to clarify, is the sub-collector of Tuticorin for a few months, right? So he was involved in a lot of the legal action against the Swadeshi Steam Company.
absolutely. So by the time Chidambaram Pillai comes out, the world is a different place. It's become completely quiet, and because he has lost his livelihood as somebody convicted under an IPC section, he could not continue to be the leader. So the rest of his life, 24 years of his life, is mired in great poverty. But he continues to work. He is involved in all the major movements of his times: the labor movement, the social reform movement, the non-Brahmin movement. He is also a literary scholar of some standing. So, though he is active, but nothing that matches the great achievement of the Swadeshi movement. So, when he dies in 1936, he has the reputation, in Tamil Nadu, even though he's completely unknown to people outside Tamil Nadu. In Tamil Nadu itself, he is seen as this selfless man who sacrificed everything and never got his due. So one of the responses that I've got to this book is, I've had people, reading this book and literally bursting into tears. Uh, the saga of sacrifice is, and that is accentuated by the fact that because this happened at a time, when record keeping was very bad, very little documentation exists. So that makes it even more poignant.
In many ways, what you describe towards the end of your book is a tragedy in many acts. I mean, first of all, VOC, of course, is arrested, and the rest of his life, as you mentioned, is in poverty, mired in debt, out of joint in some cases with politics. Once he's released, Swadeshi Steam, the company itself, goes through tremendous difficulties. So the company itself starts to founder. You talk about how a few directors, people like Panduturai Thevar, try and invest nearly all of their money in the company and lose everything. And then you have heroic efforts on the behalf of people like Subramanya Bharati, the poet, who tries to raise 2 lakhs for this company in 2 months, and of course doesn't get anywhere near that amount. But the response from the people is quite touching. I mean, you note how one person might or might not have. I mean, at least Subramania Bharati writes that this happens when a poor woman is asked for a donation for the Swadeshi Steam Company. She gives a few aubergines that she's just purchased from the market and said, "You can go have this and use it in whatever way you can to float this company." So even though this company is by and large dead by 1910, it is still evoking a tremendous amount of popular sentiment on behalf of ordinary people. People are donating stuff that they bought at the market to do their little bit to help this effort.
Yeah. So that is the, I think that is the one of the uh, biggest takeaways from the Swadeshi company. The company was a commercial failure, no doubt. But so many companies have failed. This is not the only company that failed, but it failed for a cause. But one could argue that this big blow retarded the national movement, but that's only an argument, because we find that all those who cut their teeth in the Swadeshi movement in Tamil Nadu go on later to make significant contributions. Right? Subramanya Bharati dies in 1921. That is true, but Subramanya Siva continues to work until 1925. Contracting leprosy in the prison does not stop him. He in turn trains a group of volunteers. Then you have Krishnasamy Sarma, who becomes one of the first popularizers of political knowledge. He writes books on various aspects of political science and polity. And then you have a number of, okay, let us say Thiruvi Kalyana Sundara Mudaliyar, the great journalist, labor leader, and writer. When does he get politicized? He says he went to the Madras beach and heard Bipin Chandra Pal speak. So the seeds are sown. So it could be a commercial failure. Yes, it was a commercial failure. But the Swadeshi company is not to be judged by the returns that it gave or the dividend it announced or did not announce. So
And
that,
indeed, it was a success for some time.
Yes, indeed. It was so successful that it really gave a scare to the British India Company. If it was not scared, why would it have been, go all out to crush this company?
So we're coming to the end of this episode, and the last question I want to ask is more personal in nature. This is a story that you mention in your book that you've been researching for 4 decades, something that first interested you as a youth, and has matured into, I think, several volumes in Tamil, and now this particular volume in English. Can you tell us a little bit about your own interest in VOC and Swadeshi Steam, and some of the twists and turns that you've had in your research? I mean, obviously, this is an extremely difficult topic to research, given, as you mentioned, the lack of um, documentary evidence. But you've also, as you mentioned, been in touch with, say, the descendants of Robert Ashe, that particular ex-sub-collector Tuticorin who was assassinated by revolutionaries in 1911. And so you've been in touch with his descendants and have talked to him about the family history. I mean, take us a little bit through the research that's gone into this particular book over the past 4 decades.
Okay. Then here is a very long story, so you should stop me when it goes out of hand. So when I was not yet 14, I was fired by the story of this man, and this inspiration came from an absence. I was studying in an CBSE school, and in the NCERT textbook, in the history of the freedom struggle, there is no mention of Chidambaram Pillai. That really, really infuriated me. So I started reading up on this man, and I found that the work on him was very, very minimal. So by the time I was into reading a lot, I loved biographies. As a puny boy with a snotty nose, I was really inspired by big figures. So if I couldn't become a big figure, at least I could read about them and get inspired by them. So this man captured my attention and said, "We have to write good biographies. We have to write a great biography of this man, like the ones that we see in the West about all the big names." So I started looking up the material, and step by step, by 1982, when I was 15, I chanced to see the unpublished letters of Chidambaram Pillai. Then, on a lead, I found out that there would be records of this man in the Tamil Nadu archives. So I went to the Tamil Nadu archives. They sent me away. They said that no schoolboys can't come into the archives, so you should go off. So as soon as I joined college, when I was 17, the very first week, I went to the Tamil Nadu archives, got permission, and then started looking up the records. That's when I decided that I enjoyed archaeological research so much that I decided I would become a historian. So I would not become a bank clerk or a bank officer or a chartered accountant. So I decided to. So from the Tamil Nadu archives and going into various other books and libraries, going on field work to Thuthukudi, then I was told that there are material in the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, Murthy and National Archives. So when I was 18, I went off to Delhi. So I spent 3 weeks. That opened me up to further riches. So I decided I have to do more research. So I went back in 1988 again. So all through went after Chidambaram Pillai, and not just Chidambaram Pillai. I realized that if you are to understand a man, a political leader, you have to understand his times. So that is how I branched out. I read up lot about the various movements, the political processes and movements, not only in Tamil Nadu but also in India and across the world. Then, from the National Archives and the other research, I said I have to go to London to look at the British Library. I said I have to look up the London, the Lloyd's Register of Shipping. So I went to the Maritime Museum, I went to the Guildhall Library. So my entire career has been shaped. My career as a student of history has been shaped by my search for Chidambaram Pillai. And I've learned, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, what was the reaction of Robert Ashe's descendants to being
Okay,
contacted by you?
okay. So there are also some epiphanic moments. So uh, sadly or even tragically, Indians, we do not maintain our records. So records
We're
don't
terrible at
survive.
it.
You know it better than anybody else.
Well, I think any historian knows that the
Yes.
state of archives continue to be terrible in this country.
And whatever records have survived, we have made a mess of preserving them. Okay. So one of the most there are happy moments, but some of the tragic moments in my search was that material that I saw in the 1980s don't exist anymore.
A common feature in Indian
Okay.
archives.
So this is so in the 1980s and 1990s, there was photocopying was limited. Now photocopying damaged papers. It was expensive. We didn't do it. So much of those papers are lost. What is left are only notes that I have scribbled. Some of the scrawl I can't decipher myself now. So that has been one thing. So, but in the case of Ash, I was sure that the British ruled the world because they also controlled knowledge. They maintained their papers. I'm sure that there would be something. So, following a lead, an obscure lead, which I have written about in my paper on Ash, in search of Ash in the Economic and Political Weekly. I traced his daughter-in-law and grandson to Ireland, to a small town near Dublin. So I went in 2006. So it was a very difficult moment because this is a man who is the grandson of an assassinated officer. Okay, so I am going to research the man who killed him and was responsible for his grandfather's death. So I went there. It was a very pleasant surprise because uh, Robert Ash's grandson is also Robert Ash. He's a he's a gentleman. He's a liberal who's very widely read. He was very warm. After the initial moments of hesitation, we have become friends. We are in touch with each other over the last 18 years. He bears no ill will to anybody. If at all he bears any ill will, it is towards Lord Louis Mountbatten because he says that his father, Arthur Ashe, worked in the Indian Army and he was in India during independence, what they call the transfer of power. Robert tells me that his father blamed and held Louis Mountbatten solely responsible for the violence of partition. He said could have been easily avoided. Okay, that's another story. But he kept all the papers. For nearly 100 years, they maintained the papers. It's a huge archive. Most of it is of a personal nature, but there is also some stuff. And he was generous in sharing all the material. And in fact, at the time of the assassination of Ash, of his grandfather, he sent out a message of reconciliation to the family of the assassin, our patriot Vanchi Iyer. He said, our forefathers made some mistakes. We should overcome them. We are not responsible for that. We should forget the past and try to look into the future. So that was a very interesting experience. So he has read the book, and Robert Ash said that he's he and his family are you know well, one cannot happy is not happy to know about the death of their grandfather, but he said gives him and his family an understanding of the circumstances that led to the loss of his forebear. So this is one story. So there are numerous anecdotes. It's a mixture. It's bittersweet, but I want to recall the generosity of people across India, across the world, where they supported the work of a unknown young man coming from a corner of India. They have been generous. The people have given me a roof to stay. They have fed me. They have parted with their papers. They parted with their knowledge. So I'm so grateful to all of them. And I realize that it is that generosity, though I am the recipient of it, it is actually a tribute to the selfless sacrifice and the foresightedness of Chidambaram Pillai, who wanted to build an equal, egalitarian, peaceful, and just India.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chalapathy, for joining us today. And as you mentioned, your book covers many different strands of the story of Indian nationalism and Swadeshi. In the sense that this is a story not just about the political movement, but or even a challenge to economic dominance, but in many ways also a story of a major chapter in Indian business development. And I encourage all listeners to pick up the book and understand a little bit about how a major Indian venture came really from nothing in a relatively obscure South Indian port town, had tremendous success for a number of months, if not years, before it was crushed by political circumstances. So thank you again, Chalapathy, for joining me today.